Hello, and welcome to PsychSessions, conversations about teaching and stuff. I'm Garth Neufeld, along with Eric Landrum, your podcast hosts. As the name implies, we center on conversations about teaching, but we often veer into other interesting topics, which is the and stuff. This is episode 96, where Eric had the opportunity to interview the Jane Halonen. Again, that's the second interview with Jane Halonen. And Jane is from the University of West Florida. If you haven't heard our first interview with her, go back, have a listen to it, as it gets into a lot of her backstory that they will kind of refer back to. Very interesting to hear Eric's conversation with her versus my conversation with her, and just let me reflect on that in just a moment. Before we get to that, let me just remind you that PsychSessions is now supported by STP. That's the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2. It's our incredible in-group. And Eric and I want to remind you that if you have not become a member, it's $25 a year. It's a wonderful organization. You get so much out of it, and they want your support. We want them to have your support. So please go to teachpsych.org. Just a couple things from STP. Due to the continued uncertainties caused by the pandemic, the annual conference on teaching will be held virtually this October. Please visit teachpsych.org and check under the Conferences tab for further information. And a huge congratulations to STP's newly elected officers, Linda Wolf, President-elect, congratulations, Linda, and Stephanie Offel, Secretary, Angela Legg, Vice President for Programming, Bill Altman, Vice President for Resources, and Maureen McCarthy, Division 2's representative to APA Council. A huge congratulations to you all. One of the things that we want to make you aware of is an upcoming mini-series on Ask PsychSessions, where Marianne Lloyd is talking to instructors who are seasoned in dealing with race issues, diversity issues, and anti-racism in the classroom and in general higher education. So please stay tuned to Ask PsychSessions, as those will start to be released next Tuesday, 1 week from today. Now, back to Jane Halonen. Jane Halonen has got to be one of the best people I have met in STP. One of the most generous, one of the smartest, one of the most straightforward. I think she'll like that. That's a little preview for you into this episode. And I would consider that I have this very special relationship with Jane. It's very unique. She has worked her way into my professional story, and it didn't take much, but I'm so grateful for all those interactions, and really for giving me the first bump in my career outside of my institution. And so, but when I'm thinking about Eric and Jane, it's just a whole nother level. Eric and Jane have known each other for over 30 years. They've known each other for over 30 years. I won't tell you how old I was when they first met. And that's not to make them feel old. This is to say, this is a relationship that goes back. These are topics and conversations that have a rich and developed history. When these two talk about assessment in this episode, my ears perk up, because we've got two pros who have been at it for a long time and who still... They say it's just language. I think that's what they settle on, but I think they really do disagree some. And for me, that's where the richness of a conversation like this really is. They're old friends, and so the conversation is different. When I think back about my interview with Jane a couple of years ago, it is from an early career perspective. Although somebody told me recently that I've firmly planted myself in mid-career. But I really did feel like early career when I was interviewing her. And we do this really nice chronology of where she came from and how she, got to where she is. And It's a lot of tell me about yourself, but this is a really nice conversation because Eric goes to the next level. He's got this history with her where he can ask about things that happened in particular places and gives her the opportunity to really go deeper into a couple of those stories. Some of the other things that they discuss is what they're doing together, and this is back in November, and they're at the University of Michigan together in November at a Bill McKeechee Memorial celebration that the University of Michigan hosted. And so they both attended. Bill McKeechee is very dear to them both. For Jane, he was a mentor. He gave her opportunities, and she tells stories about first meeting him, about the first time that she asked him to endorse something that she was working on. And these are just wonderful, heartwarming stories. I got to meet Bill McKeechee before he passed away, and a lot of that was due to Jane organizing things. And she wasn't able to make that trip with us, but was planning on it. And I would have loved to see them in the same room together because I know that she sees him as much more than a colleague, and even so much more than a friend. There is just a genuine love between them, and she talks about him with such respect and admiration and joy. And it seemed like whenever she was in his presence, she remarks about this, that it was an opportunity to learn. And I suspect she was learning more than just psychology. I think it was an opportunity to learn about being human and being compassionate and kind and being prolific and all those other things that Bill McKeechee was. And so that was really special to hear about. Eric's got his own past with Bill McKeechee, maybe not to that extent, but they both wrote articles about Bill McKeechee's life about a decade apart, and they're going to talk about that a little bit as well. Eric really walks us through Jane in her early career and helps us to understand that the Jane Halonen that we see today, who has written so many books and articles, who's given so many talks and organized so many committees and task forces, that this Jane Halonen was once early career Jane Halonen. And they get into some really interesting conversation related to early career decisions. One of those conversations is about, and maybe a few years into teaching, is about her participation with STP. And she would become a president eventually of APA Division II, but the first invitation that she was given was to be the head of the awards committee for STP, which she declined, which she thought was pretty funny because she wouldn't recommend that early career folks decline things, except what I thought was really funny, what I thought she was going for is now she has an STP award named after her. You really want to get that early career Jane S. Halonen award if you are in the first 10 years of your teaching career. So everybody aim for that. Jane loves to see you get that award, and we'll show up and take a picture with you. I know that has happened every year I've been involved in STP. Jane, we love you over here. We think that you are a gift to the teaching of psychology. You're definitely a gift to us as friends, as a mentor, and it's so nice to hear you. It closes the distance during this pandemic to hear these voices of our beloved colleagues. The last thing that they talk about in this episode is, well, second to last, is Guidelines 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. That's Guidelines for the Psychology Major, APA's policy document. And they talk through that, give a little history on it, which they will be working on very, very soon together with a task force of people. And the last thing that they talk about is their relationship. And Eric and Jane have a really nice moment, and you'll have to stick around for that because it was extremely touching to me. And I think I'll leave it there. So enjoy this wonderful interview, Eric Landrum with Jane Halonen.
This is a very special edition. They're all special, and maybe our guests can help me figure out a way to not put myself in those sticky wickets. I'm with Jane Halonen. Good morning, Jane.
Good morning.
It's lovely to be here. We happen to be in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about why we're here. We've always known we'd have repeat guests, and in a way, Jane's already been a repeat guest. She was with Garth on one of the very early episodes.
Yes.
And then you were featured with Randy Smith on our one and only live event to date.
Which was great fun.
It was great fun. And then you also were part of two Charles Brewer tributes.
That's correct.
So you've been a repeat guest, but you're our first repeat guest who has sat down for a one-on-one, so to speak. So
I feel honored.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was going to make a joke, but we honor you. We truly do. So I don't. How much time do we have? Hour and a half, 2 hours.
About an hour and a half. We have an hour and a half.
There's so many things I'd love to talk to you about. Maybe we should start reverse chronological. So what did Bill McKeechee mean to you?
Oh, well,
or should we start with a softball?
No, I think in view of the fact that we're in Ann Arbor right now in a lovely bed and breakfast. At the tail end of a celebration of McKeechee's life, I think that's a perfectly appropriate place to go. You and I were both part of a memorial tribute that the University of Michigan sponsored that brought relatives and colleagues and friends together for a day-long celebration of what Bill had contributed to make the quality of life that people had so much better.
Right.
And that was, I'm sure you'll agree, that was an amazing experience to be able to hear the impact of Bill.
Yes.
So my personal impact is I really see him as the guiding light of my career, not just as a teacher, but as a researcher. I was just so, we're going to use the phrase lucky, which I'm sure we'll have some conversation about given past podcasts. When I started my job at Alverno so long ago and realized I didn't know what I was doing, and big time, I mean, I really didn't know what I was doing. I had enthusiasm, but no strategies for teaching. I went to the library, and truthfully, I probably picked the smallest book, hoping that there were gems in, and I pulled Bill's book off the shelf. And of course, it answered everything that I was facing and more. And then, as the fates would have it, he and I ended up being able to work together on several APA task forces. And I became not just a fan, but a sticky fan, I like to call that. You know, whenever I had a chance to be near him, I would seize that moment, because whenever you were in his presence, you were going to learn something.
Can you go back to the early days at Alverno? So first off, was that your first job after graduate school?
It was not. When I got out of graduate school, I had applied for some academic jobs, but didn't get them. That was a hardship. But on one of the job interviews that I went on in Chicago, I did an internship in Chicago, so my husband and I were stationed in Chicago. He was working as a studio manager there. We decided that we wanted to stay there for a little while, so an unsuccessful job interview at an unnamed school in Chicago. The person who ran that interview liked me well enough that he said, "Oh, I know about this job opening that exists that you'd probably be pretty good at, and why don't you take a look at that?" So I actually became director of a special school for profoundly and severely impaired children.
Wow.
And when I look back at that and think about how little specific training I had for that, it's a little stunning that I just said, "Oh, that looks good," and plowed ahead. But I did that for 2 years. And then secretly looked on the sly for where might I get a teaching job, since that's where my heart was. Ironically, the man who recruited me for that job was the consulting psychologist for the school. And he was reading one day and said, well, here's an interesting job. And he read the job ad about Alverno, and he finished it, and then he looked at me and said, oops. And so I said, no, that does sound kind of interesting. And I applied and fortunately got the position.
He said oops because he knew that he was about to lose you.
He did. There was just that moment of telepathy or clairvoyance or something that this might have been a mistake to read that out loud.
So I think it'd be interesting for our listeners to just think about for a moment that there was a time that you were a novice. Mm-hmm. Because I think we don't think about that. I don't think we think about Bill McKeechee or Charles Brewer ever as a novice starting out. We think of them in their end state, not as the beginning state. Mm-hmm. So there was a time that, so we had a conversation yesterday. Can you talk a little bit about, so.
I know there's a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, there is. So if you hadn't gone to Alverno as your first academic job in higher ed, do you think you'd be the assessment guru that you are today?
I do not.
So it really shaped that experience at that very unique school, shaped where you would go in your professional research career.
Yes, I would give full credit to Alverno for helping me move from someone who didn't know what the hell was going on to someone that has a pretty strong reputation about this field in assessment. I do know that I would have been drawn to active learning strategies, and in fact, I remember the moment that I first thought, I wonder if I could be a teacher. And that was in college. I had a creative biology teacher that allowed us to design our own final exam, which I thought was fascinating. And I had so much fun doing it. I thought, well, isn't this an interesting way to allow people, because you'll see the motivation, you'll see the depth. Mm-hmm. And then I put that aside because I was headed to be the world's greatest clinician instead. But even on my internship, the place that I was happiest during the year of intern work was when I had the responsibility of doing an in-service for my other interns. Wow, that was instructive. So by the end of my clinical internship year, I knew I wanted an academic job. But that earlier experience with active learning helped me take stock for what is it that made the learning stick the best. It's when I wrestled with things. And in lecture classes, I can memorize. Right. I was a good note taker, but I don't think that learning stuck.
I can't remember if we've had this conversation or not before, because we've had one or two.
Or 10 or 40.
or 1,000, which have been delightful for me. Do you think your training in clinical psychology has made you a better teacher compared to if you had been trained as a developmentalist or a cognitive psychologist or whatever?
I think it probably has.
Me too, by the way.
And I would throw in that the research that I was engaged in graduate school and slightly after that was developmental psychology. So if you combine clinical skills with understanding the nature of the humans that you're teaching, it's bound to make you a little bit better in the design that you take on and also in whatever empathic kinds of responses you might have for the life stresses that students have.
Yeah, I think maybe I realized that about you. Well, I don't know. Actually, maybe I do know exactly when. Maybe it was at APA 2019, watching you part of an improv and realizing, oh, look at those clinical skills. Oh, look at that. Look how she handled that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that helped tremendously in a situation where it could have been a sticky situation, and Oh, look at that. The clinician just kicked in.
You might have to explain what that situation was.
I actually don't remember the exact. Do you remember the exact detail? It was, we were role playing something that had happened in a classroom that someone had contributed on a note card. I actually don't remember.
Oh, I think I do remember
the exact
now.
one.
I do remember it, and it will turn the podcast X-rated.
We can mark it explicit.
Yeah.
That's fine.
It was in our improv workshop that we did with Jen Dyer Seymour and Garth Neufeld. We asked people to identify complex and turbulent situations that they had, and then proceeded to use improv strategies to help them figure out other ways of resolving those difficulties. In particular, trying to get people to embrace what we lovingly referred to as a yes and standpoint. And I think we were all optimistic about how that was going to go until we had the submission of the student who wanted to talk about his penis size. Wasn't that the one?
I think that might be
yeah.
it. Yeah.
And I remember looking at you and thinking, look what you've gotten me into this time.
This time,
yeah.
I like that.
But at the time we were asking audience members
Right.
to act out that. And I think the audience member who was in that situation was giving deep thought to how she wanted to engage that. And I think you kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Get in there, Jane." And
First off, so I love your imitation of my voice. And I'm going to have Garth clip that as my ringtone.
okay,
Get in there, Jane. Get in there, Jane. Get in there, Jane. All right, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
that's all right. In any case, I remember turning to look at you and thinking, well, we probably should let her finish her process, but you were insistent. So I yielded, which is a problem where you and I are concerned that when you approach me with something, I usually yield. Yeah.
It hasn't been a problem lately, has it?
No,
let's
it's
put
been
a pin in that. We'll circle back to it.
It's been delightful.
Yeah.
But I think I sat down and opted to treat that as something that was collaborative with the student, which is, when you're trying to build a bridge to a student with somebody who's worried about penis size, that's a hard bridge to build.
Right.
But then the interaction worked out really well at taking that stance.
Yeah, but that's because I think you had a method and a plan for it to work out really well, whereas the rest of us mere mortals might not have that plan because we don't have that built-in skill set. And I think part of it, honestly, is we might not have that confidence that we know it's going to turn out.
Okay, so the only correction I would make in that is you're assuming I had a plan, and I actually didn't have a plan.
Yeah, but I think don't you think that's where that clinical training skill set comes in? Maybe you didn't have an overt plan, but don't those skills then kind of kick in?
Absolutely. I'm going to say expert judgment, that 10-year window compilation of what happens, certainly. But, I mean, it started out with, I'm just going to do some simple reflection and try to get underneath this. But certainly not a plan of an elaborate nature.
Yeah, but that you knew I'm going to do some simple reflection to try to get underneath this.
Okay, that does sound like a plan, doesn't it?
It kind of does, and I'm not so sure. Here's what my plan was: Jane, get in there. Jane, get in there. My plan was I knew the person that if this went south, I kind of know who can solve this for us.
Well, that's nice.
That was my plan is surround yourself with people who can do great things and then they can fix it.
Yeah, that's a philosophy I endorse too. Surround yourself with people who are smarter than you.
Yeah,
can.
yeah. That's what I like too.
Yeah.
So I don't want to leave our Bill McKeechee conversation just yet. Do you remember the first time you met him in person?
I do.
Would you mind telling that story?
I'd be happy to. I had been encouraged to look Bill up, is the way my dean put it. I was blessed with maybe the smartest, most wonderful dean you could have. Her name was Austin Doherty at Alverno. A Franciscan nun with a big heart and just wonderful instincts. She said, I think if I know you've been reading Teaching Tips, but Bill's going to be at this conference that you're going to, and I want you to give him my regards, which I think was her way of making sure that I connected with someone. I'd have a reason. As a young instructor, people tend to be a little bit more hesitant to make those connections. But now I can go to him and say, oh, Austin says hello. So that was my agenda for that meeting. And it would have been in Atlanta, so that might have been 1986. I approached him at the what would have been Division II social hour and talked with him. And ultimately asked him if he would consider writing a preface for my very first book that I edited. Boy, you talk about bold. And Bill, being Bill, he said, oh, I would be honored to do that. And so ultimately, we ended up securing him as an endorser of the book. And I think he actually liked the book. I don't think that was anything that he was doing as a compliance with social norms.
So what book was it?
It was a book that grew out of a FIPSI grant that Alverno got to explore critical thinking in the disciplines. And as it turned out, in my second year of my career, I was heading up the psychology task force that involved recruiting 10 faculty from all over the country to come to Alverno for 2 consecutive summers to define what it meant to teach critical thinking.
Okay.
And then we wrote up the results of that.
So 1986, Division II, social hour, a faculty member who Bill McKeechee had never met before,
Right.
maybe never heard of before,
Guaranteed never heard of before.
walks up to him during a social hour. He's got a Coke in his hand because we know he doesn't have a drink in his hand.
That's correct.
He's got a Coke maybe if he's living it up with ice, and asks him cold, would you be willing to write a preface or a foreword? And he says yes.
Yes.
Who does that?
Well, I think I might have greased the skids a little bit by saying Austin says hi.
Okay.
And the fact is, Bill recognized that Alverno was doing something pretty distinctive back then, so
Okay.
he always had a lot of curiosity about what this little experimental school that was no longer granting grades to people, how were they going to survive? So I think he just was naturally inquisitive about that, and so I think that helped him
Sure.
say yes. But I think, not to take away from his character, I think he was inclined to say yes to things, even though we know from the archival studies that we did yesterday at the Bentley Historical Center here on the campus that the number of requests that he got for his time and energy is astronomical.
Yeah, staggering.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how he said yes and how many times he traveled nationally and internationally is astounding. It's I don't know if you and I'll come back together again someday, but I'll come back someday just to map that out and to map out the number of travel days and dates and yeah.
Well, you should be able to do that given the pack rat that he was about his records.
Yeah, and just, and then to hear his colleagues yesterday talk about how often he was in the office. And I don't know.
Well, not just his office, but their offices.
Yeah, around
that was
campus.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, it was. And so I just, I'm not so sure that if a relative stranger came up to me at a conference today and said, would you write a preface for some project that I've never heard of, but Regan says hi, would I immediately say yes?
Well,
I think I'd probably say, well, email it to me and let me look at it, and when's the due date, and I'll see if I have the bandwidth to do it.
Well, first of all, it would depend on whether they liked Regan.
Or Yes. Yeah. But I mean, you used the entree of someone that you thought he held in esteem. I mean, I get that. I mean, which is a good strategy, of course, but I'm just not, it was an incredibly generous gesture.
It was generous and very typical of the way Bill behaved. And then he continued that generosity throughout his career with me. Shortly after that, I can't remember if I was assigned or volunteered, or if I volunteered to do that biographical piece on Bill that where the title is "I Was Just Lucky," because that's what he's known for, is blaming everything on luck. But I did ask him to come to Alverno to do an in-service so that we could do that. And I remember there was this, and I have to admit to an embarrassing moment. We're getting ready to do this sort of thing where we're going to do audio taping of the interview. And I thought, well, I'll try to put him at his ease and explain stuff. And as I started to explain, he smiled at me and said, I'm kind of familiar with this process because I was the first person to do the televised psychology course. I felt like I was about 4 inches tall. And then, of course, he was smooth and wonderful and acted as though there was no technology in front of him.
Right.
Yeah, which you would expect.
Yeah, I have the same lack of recollection. You wrote the piece that was in 1992 in the 100 Years Teaching book, which is an amazing resource, which I grabbed a lot of ideas from. I was honored to write the General's Corner in 1999, but I've been trying to rack my brains. I don't know how I got tapped for that.
Actually, I know.
Was it you?
It was me.
So thank you very much.
The General's Corner, back then I was the associate editor for Randy, and the General's Corner was my invention. And so my primary job as associate editor was going out to recruit targets and interviewers. And sometimes I'd start with the interviewer, and sometimes I'd start with the target.
Thank you.
So it was me. I wanted to yell out yesterday, it was me, when you said that.
You should have. It would have been awesome, because I don't think I had a connection with him before that. I mean, I knew of him, and I actually had a copy of. I have 3 different versions of Teaching Tips, of which he signed the last version, and which led to then another book chapter, and then which led to other things.
And your redefinition of his luck.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to focus on that. I think it's his shorthand for being humble, which is delightful and makes him all the more lovable and loved.
It is, but I have to say I was struck by how pervasive that theme was yesterday. Virtually every speaker got up to talk about either his humility or the fact that he referred to himself as a lucky man.
Well, and he obviously, I thought of him as the definition of humility. In fact, one of the things I didn't say yesterday in this symposium for him is that when I developed this dispositional humility scale and I published it in 2011, it wasn't on Qualtrics, it was paper and pencil.
Way back then.
Yeah, way in the olden days, in the olden times. And I sent it to him, and he sent it back. And I have it. And I jokingly said to him once, you understand this is my answer key, right, to what dispositional humility is. Bill McKeechee. So I have it in his glorious handwriting. I think he wrote me a note on it. And so I have the envelope that it came in, and I have his actual, and it's in a glassine file. I have that.
Now, I'm assuming his feedback was positive?
Positive, but but he actually, I presented it at MPA before it got published, probably a couple of years before. And I think he had a constructive comment, of which I valued actually even more than a compliment, because he was actually taking my research seriously, which was awesome.
I'm just thinking yesterday of the story that we heard from one of the participants who got back the 3-word summary of his work.
Right.
Which surprised me a little bit, but Bill had apparently read it and written good but boring.
On someone's dissertation that he was chairing. Yeah, that would be, That would be, good from Bill McKeechee is like great, but I guess a dissertation is not supposed to be exciting, but boring would kind of make your heart sink a little bit.
Yeah, I think crushing might be the right word.
All right. So I actually did think about this interview a little bit beforehand. It may not be as random as some of them. Not that the disagreement matters, but you and I disagree slightly on the definition of assessment and what the function of assessment is. So I don't want to focus on my definition. I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you see the role of assessment, how you define it, your big picture thoughts for our audience, please.
Okay. I'd love to talk about assessment in Janeland.
Yes. And
where things are perfect.
It's not Jane World, it's Janeland.
No, it's Janeland.
Okay.
It's Janeland.
Okay.
I do know that my experience at Alverno shaped how I think about assessment. And as it turns out, back in those days, Alverno did a substantial amount of faculty development, which in the early days for me was glorious because I was a sponge soaking up everything. And everyone at Alverno functioned like an educational psychologist. So everyone knew about the Kolb learning cycle, and everyone knew about Perry's work, and everybody knew about, it seemed to me they knew about everything, which was one of the reasons I felt like such an imposter when I started out. But that meant faculty development before the semester began, faculty development in the interim between semesters, and a 2-week faculty development period after the semester is over. And on top of that, faculty would be charged with writing narrative transcripts for all of the graduates. So the workload at Alverno was pretty substantial. What I acquired in those early days was a kind of view of the world that sometimes people referred to as you'd become an Alvernoid. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I haven't heard that one.
Not everyone likes that term. I think it's kind of funny, but the thrust of our training was that you do assessment because it helps students learn, and usually the Latin essere would be invoked. It means to sit beside. And so when you are assessing someone, you are sitting beside them in the hopes that the feedback that you're providing for them will make a difference and, in best cases, be transformative. So that's the core of the way I think about assessment. And unfortunately, especially over the last couple of years, the nature of assessment and what it's used for, especially when it becomes part of performance metrics, really removes us from that fundamental, can you do something with students in feedback that helps them learn? So when I'm giving an assessments, even now when I assess my students, my assessments aren't just, I'm not just measuring them, I'm giving them an opportunity to learn through the measurement. And so that may be idealistic, but I think it does not fit with that strategy that you do assessment so that you can figure out what you're doing wrong or what you can do better or how it fits into department obligations for the annual report.
So it's almost like we need better terminology, and this is not an overly unique idea. Because you and I have talked about assessment versus grading. Assessment and grading and evaluation are three different things, but there's probably other shades of gray in there.
Yeah.
I mean,
in fact, let me interrupt
please,
you there.
Go for it. No, please.
The difference between assessment and grading doesn't give students a chance to learn anything. Is it a form of assessment? I suppose you can say it is, but just the slapping on of a grade does nothing. That reinforces how did I do in relation to other people, and that tends to encourage the behavior in students that I can't abide, which is grade grubbing. Whereas assessment, what did you do well on this project? What could you have done better if you had to do it over? I usually have to say, I'm not going to make you do it over, but if you had to do it over, what would you do differently? to develop better self-reflective skills so that when students graduate, they are self-directed.
So if we stay right there in that lane of giving students feedback in the midst of a semester, what label or term would you use for within that process how faculty might improve? Because I have a different term that I think confuses things.
Okay. I prefer assessment is focused on the student.
Right.
I like the term evaluation, and I know that also gets people nervous, but often the big distinction for me is, are you doing this for assessment to help students learn? Are you doing this to determine if you're doing the right thing, in which case that's course evaluation, that's teacher evaluation, that's program evaluation. And so making that distinction for me in my head, that makes it a little bit clearer.
Okay.
And I don't think evaluation is necessarily a word that should send up red flags. But unfortunately, in our era, it does.
I think there's a you've got grading, you've got assessment, you've got evaluation. I think there's I don't know if that's a hierarchy. Maybe they're not ranked. I think there's a fourth one in there that doesn't have a term.
Okay.
That is in between assessment and evaluation, which is the use of student performance outcomes for me to improve as an instructor, but is not evaluation of my performance for annual performance reviews.
Well, the language that is used in the assessment world for that distinction is formative versus summative.
Yeah.
Right?
But isn't formative versus summative that's for students?
Why couldn't it be for faculty?
Because I think that you're right, but yes and but that
yes, but it's really a yes, but, folks.
I think it just confuses people because we think of formative and summative from a student perspective of feedback. I think that's. I don't think we disagree. I think I just think there's an added level in there.
Well, I think the distinction is: do you use the results just for you, or do you use the results to turn into the department head because there's some external overlord that wants to know about quality?
It's a yes, both. So in fact, there's an example I give in a talk where I can use grading for a student assignment. But if I use a rubric in Blackboard, I can get feedback on my performance, but I can also give that to my department chair or my dean now, and I can spin that into a rubric report that an accrediting commission would be delighted to have. Because
absolutely true.
I can link it to APA Guideline 1.3 and show progression over time of what we're doing well or not doing so well. But it has to be well thought out. It has to be pre-planned. It has to be aligned. It has to have all these things.
That's a lot of architecture.
That's why I got thrown off yesterday when we had a delightful assessment geek out moment.
We did
in the Hyatt lobby. So
when we were supposed to be writing on something. So
we were, Woolies. We were. Don't panic. It's all coming together. All right. Jane, so let's go from let us go from Alverno to Jane Zena Halonen. Did I get that right?
You did.
Did I get Zena happened at James Madison University?
Yeah, I was Zena at JMU.
Jane X Halonen.
That's correct.
So I don't know if you talked about this with Garth, and I don't know how much you want to go into it here. What prompted that change? And then what were the new challenges at JMU?
All right. What prompted the change, and I don't, my friends at Alverno, I hope they're not offended by this, but I made a distinction about in the beginning I was an eager sponge. Along about the 17th year of being developed, I found during one of the development sessions, I like to describe this, I found myself rocking like a Harlow monkey.
And you weren't in the towel condition? You were in the wireframe condition?
I was clearly separated from my mother, and I was having anxiety troubles. But I was showing anxious behavior. I really was rocking. And I thought something's wrong. And I thought, oh, you know what? I think I'm as developed as I want to be in this context. And I recognized that maybe I'd been restless for a little while. And then, of course, later on in life, I learned from my mentor, Bill McKeechee, that in fact I was a perfect example of what he called being pluckable. That I had done everything in that setting that I had wanted to do. I'd been a department coordinator. I'd been a division head. I'd been head of heads, which meant, the person that talked to the provost when things were rugged. I'd been faculty senate president. So I'd done, and I didn't want to do anything higher in the food chain. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was time for me to do something different. So I had been a program reviewer for James Madison on some curriculum matters, and ironically met a lot of the people that eventually would be in the department that I was head of. I got hired in as head. At that time, Ginny Matthey, a very dear friend, was head of the department. And of course, my worry is that when you come in following someone who is so lovely and beloved as she is, that there might be some real challenges, and there were.
Well, don't you? Was it a red flag that they were doing a national search, and they didn't internally appoint?
I think that tended to be the JMU way, rather than because there may have been some internal candidates at the time, and I actually wasn't their first choice. Their first choice was somebody else.
You're not supposed to know that.
Yeah, well, I know that.
Do you know who their first choice was?
Their first choice was someone who had graduate experience, because they were hiring in for someone to be the head of the largest undergrad program on campus, master's level programs, a PsyD program, and an on-campus clinic. And so...
Yeah, but you didn't answer the question.
What was the question?
Do you know who the first choice was?
No.
Oh, I'm not asking you to tell me.
Yeah, I didn't know. Gotcha. I just knew that the person who got the nod was someone with graduate background.
A different level of experience. Yeah. Gotcha.
And when I got the call saying, sorry, but no thanks, the person making the call was gracious and said, we found we're in this unusual situation. We have two perfectly acceptable candidates. I'm thinking, I don't like the way this is going.
This is a weird call.
Yeah. And then the phrase was, and we're having a conversation with the other person. And I'm thinking, okay, so in higher ed, if I decode that, I think that means sorry, Toots, not you. And that's what it meant. But it turned out about 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, got a call. The same person said, with hat in hand, I'm coming to you to ask, would you consider taking this position because our other candidate ultimately declined?
Oh my gosh, what an inappropriate first call.
Well, inappropriate?
Yeah, you don't call someone and say, sorry, you don't get the job, and then call back 3 weeks later, oops.
Well,
we made a mistake.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would completely agree with that, because to say we have two perfectly acceptable candidates, okay, I'm acceptable, just not quite as acceptable.
But
that's a little different than saying we hated you, don't come.
No, but you don't say anything. I think that's really odd.
Oh, I got more odd.
Okay, but they should have been assuming that you were on the job market at other schools, meaning that phone call releases you from waiting to hear from them. Mm-hmm. You could have very easily taken another job within those intervening 3 weeks.
I could have, but I don't recall that I'd applied to many places.
Right, but they don't know that.
True.
So yeah. I just think, well, it's not, what I think is not really relevant.
Yeah.
But that's just a really weird strategy to call up someone. We have two perfectly qualified candidates. But it doesn't look like it's going to be you.
That's correct.
Okay, boy. Good for you for being open-minded and forgiving.
Well, it was a good choice
Okay.
because the years I spent at James Madison, I truly loved the people that I worked with
Right,
there.
yeah.
Some of the best teachers in America are housed there.
I agree.
And the atmosphere, they were assessment friendly, which was one of the things I was looking for, and I think one of the reasons they were interested in me. And I feel like I was able to make some really good hiring decisions so that the department continued to grow strong. They got used to my more directive, more direct, more field commander style that I have compared to Ginny. So that transition wasn't awful.
Can you talk a little bit? What do you mean by field commander style?
The leadership style that I have is one where I tend to be a pretty fast decision maker. And in those moments when I've gotten feedback on my style, people say, "Oh, you're refreshingly direct," which sometimes can translate into other, you're too blunt, you're too, you say more than we want to hear at times. You may be too direct. And in particular, I remember it at JMU. I met someone who was visiting the department, and we had this lovely chat. And he said, "You're going to have trouble here." I said, "Well, that's kind of bold. Why do you think?" And he said, "Well, because you've got Midwestern machoism." I said, "Well, please instruct me. What the hell is that?" And he said, "Well, you're from the Midwest where everything is flat and you can see everything. And here, this is different. We sort of live in the mountains and you don't know what's around the corner, so you don't always tell everybody everything that you know." It's like, wow, that's goofy and wildly predictive, that the times that I did struggle tended to be those where that directness of style was a problem.
Was that person right about about people at JMU in general?
I don't think it was so much JMU as it was the setting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I do think there was an adjustment contrasting Ginny Matthey's lovely, wonderful, super sensitive style versus, we're very close friends, but our styles of managing are very different.
Okay. And how long were you at JMU?
I was there for 5 years.
5 years, and you said that when you arrived, you were department head, but did that change to chair while you were there?
It changed to school director.
Oh, okay.
So it went from a department, and this happened after I accepted the job. In fact, I remember at the AP reading, the group that I was working with that year at the AP reading, they were celebrating the fact that I was getting this new job, and they gave me a hat that said head on it. And by the time I got to JMU, the hat was out of date because they had translated. And this was a good move for JMU, that taking the department into school status recognized really how complex the job was.
Yeah. So 5 years, and that's about, from what I've read, that's about average of administrators, deans, department chairs, provosts. 5
years is probably an optimal time to be able to get any kind of vision accomplished.
Yeah, and so I don't know. We can always edit. You listen enough that we can always edit. Were you? Was it? 17 years, you got the itch. You started to rock back and forth. 5 years at JMU. Were you shown the door? Did you get the itch? Did you start to rock?
It is a sensitive question, but let me see if I can answer this in a way that doesn't require editing.
Okay.
The challenges around my selection to begin with, I had no graduate experience in the beginning. The perception that I was not the right person for managing the graduate programs, I think that tended for one particular group at JMU to become a mantra.
Okay.
And unfortunately, they were a powerful group. And so despite the fact that my evaluations of performance were really strong, there was a decision made to take the school and divide it into a graduate program and an undergraduate program.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the offer on the table was that I could stay at the undergraduate level as the head, and they would move to do something different at the grad level. And because I thought that was problematic, partly because the glorious Michael Stoloff, who was running the undergraduate program, would have been displaced if I had accepted that offer. I didn't think that was fair to him. Besides, he was brilliant as the undergraduate director, and so I thought that should continue. That would make it more stable. So the arrangement that we negotiated was that I would step back to faculty, but I would do so with a kind of I think what we had negotiated was I was going to be a distinguished teacher of the college and do so at a reduced workload. And that always is intriguing to me, that when you win distinction in teaching, you get rewarded by having to teach less.
Yeah.
But I frankly knew that didn't feel good to me. And so I needed a different pool to play in. And because I didn't like the way it unfolded, I thought maybe I needed to be at the table. And so that's when I thought I would apply for a dean's job. And I can't remember if I've told this story before, but my husband had some premonition that we'd end up in Pensacola. A long time ago, 30 years ago. He said, we're going to be in Florida, we're going to be in Pensacola. I said, you're crazy, I don't like Florida. Take your new wife and go, 'cause I'm not going. But he said, no, we're going to be in Pensacola, and I don't know why. But when I saw the ad for UWF, the ad was reflective of the fact there was a brand new president at UWF. It was a psychologist, John Kavanaugh. His inauguration speech really spoke to me. The values were very close to my heart. And so I showed my husband the ad. He said, I guess we'll start packing. And I said, well, I think you got to let me apply first to see. And so he said, no, we're moving. So he turned out to be right, and that was a happy match. Although I also had a kind of a weird story happen with that hire as well. We'd been narrowed down to 3 candidates, 1 internal, 2 external. And Florida is a sunshine state, so if you wanted to figure out who you were up against, you easily could. Well, you either want me or you don't, so I'm not going to do that research. But around the time that I got the call that they were making me the offer, I also got a call from the other external candidate. Yeah, I know, it's really not okay.
For the listeners, I just tilted my head in an odd frame.
And the other candidate introduced himself, and he said, you know who I am? I'm thinking, no, I don't. And then he said the name of the university they work for, and then I put it together. I knew the other candidate was from this university. And he inquired if I'd heard anything. Well, this is so grossly inappropriate.
What the hell?
Right? So I said, well, I've been talking with people because I'm not sure where this is going. And he said, well, what does that mean? And I said, well, I've borrowed from my first experiences. I've been in conversation with them. And he said, did they offer you the job? I said, yes, they did. And he said, oh, well, I'm calling because I wanted to tell you that I'm withdrawing. And the reason that I'm withdrawing is, he gave me some rationale. And he said, but I need to warn you that I was told that the administrators were going to ignore what the faculty wanted. And so you might be walking into something that's not okay. So, okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that information. I hung up, conferred with my husband, who happens to have a degree in organizational science, which is really handy in these situations.
Sure.
And so then I called back the person who'd offered me the job and said, I just had an unusual call. I I need to find out from you if was there a big difference between administrators and faculty in the choice? And it doesn't mean that I won't take the job, but it means that my strategy coming in would be different. So, and then I said, and you need to know that I just talked with the other candidate who says he's withdrawing, so let the negotiations begin. And fortunately, the man I was talking to had a good sense of humor, and he laughed, and it upped the offer.
Good.
Yeah.
So I want to ask one question about career stuff, and then I want to switch gears.
All right.
Is it really that different? So I've been at an undergraduate institution my entire career. Is there really a big challenge in administering a department that has a graduate program? So if you're a department chair, let's say, is that really a big deal? Is it that much different for a department chair to have an undergrad and grad as opposed to undergrad only?
No, I think the work is the same, but I think the constituency problem is that when you make decisions about scarce resources, it tends to frame how people are going to think of you. And so when I arrived at JMU, the assumption was that I'd be devoting all my attention and energy to undergraduate stuff, which is one of the reasons why, as a head or a director, I taught in both programs. I taught in the undergrad program in the fall. I taught in the grad program in the spring. I also managed to get a publication or two with the grad students. So I think my track record there with grad students was pretty good. My evals were pretty good. So I don't think there's really that much difference, but it becomes a convenient factor to explain, to hang your hat on if you want to be mad at an administrator for a decision that didn't go your way.
Yeah, since I don't have experience there, and I've heard stories of other people around the country who sometimes are taken to task by one group or the other that they're not being satisfied.
Yeah, I think it's an inbuilt problem when there are grad and undergrad programs. And as well, there's, I have to say, overall, there tends to be a bias that if people are teaching at both levels, most faculty tend to prefer working with grad students, and they may sometimes make demands that they should have reduced time loads, workloads as a result. And sometimes I think those requests aren't really justifiable.
Sure. So I want to switch gears. I want to talk about, for a little bit, there's this organization that you've been a part of. I'm trying to think of the acronym. I think it's called APPA. It's APA, the American Psychological Association, yes, that you've been affiliated with just for a few days now. I'm not going to remember the exact phrase, but I think I've said this about you. You are the most renowned author of publications who's not gotten credit for those publications. You know what I'm talking about, right? And so, and I don't know of how much of that comes through affiliation with Bill McKeechee or Charles Brewer or just on your own. Maybe we start with Guidelines 1.0, or maybe it starts before that. Maybe it starts with your Division II presidency. I'd like to talk about where does all of that start, APA and Division II, and I really would love to talk a little bit about Guidelines 1.0, 2.0, and actually 3.0.
Yeah, coming soon.
To a theater near you.
Yeah, we hope. I began my association with APA 1986 when I attended my first conference. I decided to go to Atlanta late, so all of the hotel rooms were taken up, and I had to get a hotel room that required my taking the MARTA to get downtown. And I remember looking at the APA program being completely mind-boggled by how big it was, but I was going to have to make a choice. Do I enact my clinical roots, or do I do my teaching thing? And I decided I think the teaching program looks more appealing to me. So that's the route I decided to go. And I went to my very first symposium. Tom McGovern was running a symposium on, it doesn't matter, whatever he had to talk about was always brilliant.
Right.
And I had the opportunity to take an open seat next to Maureen Hester. Sister Maureen, the patron saint of Division II back then, who simply took me under her wing and introduced me to STP and its spirit. And I was immediately hooked, which I think is the fate for most of us, that once we get into that crowd and recognize the generosity of spirit, and you just immediately feel comfortable. And so what, for many first-timers, APA can be completely overwhelming. I was, except for having to ride on the MARTA to get back and forth from my hotel, I was completely comfortable right from the beginning. And that led to leadership opportunities within STP. I do remember Steve Davis offering my, this is embarrassing, offering me my first opportunity to run something. He wanted me to run the teaching awards. And I told him no, because I didn't believe in teaching awards.
Why is that embarrassing?
Well, because they're actually pretty cool when you get them. And at the time, I don't know if that was a function of being an Alvernoid, where we just didn't do stuff like that. I'm not sure what it was, but I didn't realize that was an opening to become part of the STP, if you can call it the inner circle, the folks who were managing things.
So it doesn't seem like it's hurt you too bad in the long run. And plus, the power to say no is a pretty important power. So good for you.
I knew it wasn't the right thing for me at that point, but I also did not realize that that my first opportunity, I said no. And I wouldn't advise most people, if it's a first opportunity, I'd say think about that carefully. But then I became a program chair, and having to deal with the complexity of running the programs at APA, valuable learning experience, but also a great proving ground for, are you going to do what you say you're going to do? And then along with meeting all the famous characters along the way, Charles Brewer, McKeechee, McGovern, Maureen, pretty soon there's this cadre of people that you just can't wait to see every year. And so that became a fixture for me. I'm
just going to insert in this timeline. I got to have Jane Halonen and Tom McGovern on my Boise State campus in I'm going to say 1994.
That sounds about right.
When the two of you came out for a program review. I'm going to put a pin in that because I don't want to. I'll come back to that later.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many pins do we have now?
I think there's at least 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, because I had that Alverno Outcomes Are Us background, I think Marky Lloyd was the one who gave me a call one day in my office at Alverno and said, who are the smartest people in assessment that you know? I thought, well, that's an interesting call. So I rattled off some names, and she said, thank you very much, and hung up. And I had no idea what was going on, but a few days later she called and said, well, all of those people have agreed to be on this task force to look at outcomes, and now I'd like you to chair it. So that is the slickest strategy to get someone to sign on to what's going to be some hard work. But it was a wonderful committee, and that ultimately led to the first guidelines.
So the people that you named comprised Guidelines 1.0?
Yes.
So if I went back and looked, oh, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yeah. Except for the APA usually reserves a space for a BEA member, a Board of Educational Affairs member, or a Board of Directors person.
Okay.
She went and got everybody that I said was good.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And you chaired 1.0.
I did. I chaired.
Yeah. And so, and if I remember correctly, so 10 recommendations came out of 1.0.
That's correct.
And there was an arduous process to get it through council.
Yeah, I'm not sure arduous actually even comes
Okay.
close to how hard it really
Okay.
was. I always like to give credit to Mary Allen and Cal State because they came up with the original framework that my group was smart enough to say, this looks like it's pretty good, so let's just tweak it a bit. And that was dividing psychology up into what are really psych skills versus what are liberal arts skills. So that ended up with 10 specific outcomes or goals or objectives or domains, whatever language you like. But the reason that it was arduous is for a couple factors. One was APA was going through some weird thing about whether you could have standards or whether it had to be named guidelines, or was there a better word for it?
Principles or
Principles.
whatever, yeah.
And so for 2 years, I just referred to it as the national thingies to wait until they could settle on what it was. But the 2 years that it took them to decide, that was 2 years that was lost to us. In addition, we had to do really heavy politicking the first year out because no one had seen anything like this before. There'd been similar work done at the high school level. In fact, Bill McKeechee and I were the consultants on that one, which I think is the reason that I got this gig. And so we had to visit the old-fashioned way. We had to go to all the constituent groups and present and listen to people. We had to go to the day that voting took place and listen to the open floor. And I mean, that was an ordeal. I do remember sitting in that meeting, and Neil Lutsky, for some reason, was there as an affiliate, so he didn't have voting rights, but at one point he held up a sign that had guidelines with a circle and a line drawn through
Oh my
it.
gosh.
Well, Neil and I used to fight about everything
Okay.
in STP, so that it stands to reason. I don't know if that's the way he really felt or if he was just pulling my chain. But ultimately, Charles Brewer decided after 1 year of intense politicking, he said, we've got to take it back and make some tweaks because I'm thinking it may not pass in its current form. And while I wasn't happy with that decision, I think he was probably right. So we delayed it a little bit, and then the next time around, it passed with not much difficulty.
Wow. And then by the time 2.0 came along, it passed with no difficulty, if I recall.
It passed with no difficulty for a couple reasons. One is that they'd seen the document before, and so to invest in rereading reading a similar document meant it was not very inspiring for them to do so. They didn't take quite the minuscule approach that they did the first time around. Second, John Norcross was the person who was giving us some political advice about how to manage the process. And in fact, when the time came for 2.0, I didn't think we were quite ready to go. But John said, no, Jane, do it now. Do it now. Take the document, get it done. I said, why are you so eager about this, John? And he said, because they'll be in Hawaii and they'll want to get to the beach.
Oh my gosh.
Which was brilliant,
right,
and accurate. So it took very little to be able to get Guidelines 2.0 passed.
Isn't that interesting?
It was.
Yeah. And 3.0 is on the horizon.
Yes, what we understand is that APA is currently assembling the task force that will take a look at 3.0. And before people get twirled out about, oh my God, are they going to throw out Guidelines 2.0? This is a natural revision process that's built into APA governance, that every 10 years, anything that's in policy form needs to be looked at in case the context has changed. And I do think there are likely to be some changes. I don't know if there'll be massive changes, but from my mind, the assessment world has changed in the past 10 years. And we want to have a document that is something that helps departments rather than something that gets in the department's way. So there may be some pruning that would be judicious in Guidelines 2.0. As well, we need to be able to figure out how to incorporate the work that's being done by the terrific group that was assembled for the APA Introductory Psychology Initiatives. They've been working on assessment and outcomes. As you know, we've been part of that process.
Right.
So Guidelines 3.0 will have to figure out how do you make sure you incorporate all good work and still keep the document friendly and helpful to departments? So that'll be the job.
And I just want to tell our listeners, we're recording this in November of 2019, but by the time this podcast comes out, it'll be 3 or 4 months later. You might already know about the 3.0 lineup, and the timeline might already be
I'm
available.
expecting to learn who the appointments are probably in the next month or 2 months.
Yeah, and is it fair to say that you will likely be leading the charge for 3.0?
It appears that, yes, I will be once again taking the chair job.
I think that is a very good decision, given your expertise
Well,
and
thank
your
you.
in the past leadership on that. A couple more topics. I've had you here for a while, and you may be interested in getting up and stretching your legs, but I've got you here if you don't mind a little while longer. Program reviews and going around the country. I did want to circle back to that pin. You've seen some good ones. You've seen some bad ones.
I have.
What's your? Do you have a big takeaway? Do you have either piece of advice or insights that you have from that process that you could share?
Plenty.
Okay. All right.
I think I've now done, it's probably closing in on 40 program reviews. I didn't do program reviews when I was a dean because I just didn't have the time to devote to it in the way I wanted to. But one of the joys of stepping back to the classroom is, I've arranged my schedule so that I have Thursdays and Fridays relatively flexible so that I can accommodate that, because program reviews are fascinating. From a clinical standpoint, they're fascinating. From an organizational standpoint, and then because I just simply love psychology curriculum, watching what people do to it, both in its glory and the flip side of that, it's just extremely interesting. So the puzzle of it is something that I find very satisfying to do. I have a taxonomy for departments. I have the dream team places where the criterion is, could I be happy here as a teacher?
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the middle group, which is they're doing a serviceable job and students are getting their tuition dollars worth, but no thank you, I don't want to work here. And then there's the, oh my God, I'd rather teach physics than be involved in this department.
Out of the 40, how many have been in the bottom tier?
I would say fewer than 5.
Fewer than 5.
And none have been at the level that Ludi Benjamin, who I regard as the person who trained me how to do good program reviews, ironically at Albion College, which is near here. None have been a circumstance where I would want to go to the provost and say, fire them all and start over. That's not pretty. I think Ben was once. But there have been programs that are the faculty have gotten themselves so hopelessly entangled in interpersonal warfare that they've forgotten what they're there for. And the students and the staff suffer, as do the faculty that are investing so much energy in trying to prove themselves right and others wrong. Or that they have simply forgotten that this should be a civil, at the very least it should be a civil enterprise. And Dana Dunn and I've had many conversations. He's probably, I don't know who would be the person doing the most. He might be the most reviewing person.
I think you are, actually. And I think Dana's number 2.
He's probably number 2.
I think I'm probably around 4 or 5. Okay. I've done about 16, 17. I'd have to count them up.
Yeah.
I think Susie Baker and Maureen.
Yep.
I'd put the 4 of you right up there. Maybe I think Barney's done a fair amount.
Barney's done some as well.
Yeah.
Well, Dana and I've had conversations. In fact, we wrote a Chronicle article about what happens when you walk into one of those nightmare departments. For me, the prime example of that is getting picked up at the airport and having the person who picks you up say to you, "Oh, I'm so glad we have this time alone together so I can tell you the truth of what's going on." And you know this is going to be a real challenge for the next couple of days.
Yeah.
On the other hand, If you're in a dream team place, it takes you about 15 minutes to figure that out. Now, we get advanced communication. If the advanced communication is written by one person, that's a hint that maybe things are not going to be smooth. If the voice is just so crisp, and then as you start talking with faculty, they're disconnected from what's going on in assessment. They only know what's going on in their own class. They're not particularly thrilled with students. They want to spend time talking about how crappy students are these days. Those are not so much fun places.
Right.
But students collectively may be able to. The faculty collectively may be able to deliver a decent education. But the dream team places are, oh man, hire me now.
So I know you'll be professional enough not to mention any names, but how would you characterize the worst department you ever reviewed? I mean, what was going on? And I know you'll anonymize it, and I know you'll be professional about it.
Well, how about if I just give you characteristics?
Sure.
So that will make it stretch across the ones that were problematic.
Okay. You mean like the worst one and the second most worst one that you ever visited?
Yeah.
Okay.
The faculty stopped talking to each other altogether. The faculty won't ever meet because they'll break out in fights. I don't think I've ever seen fist fights, although I have seen that as a dean. Departments that have members that try to physically harm each other. That's always fun. Students are negotiated to take sides.
Yeah, it's not good.
It really isn't, because faculty matters. That kind of politics is not anything students should ever know about, ever.
That's right.
Disregard of anything that shows people are paying attention to what's going on the national scene. And faculty members who behave like they're islands. So it's not just that we don't talk to each other. It's that I don't care what you're doing, and I don't see what the connection is between what you're doing and what I'm doing. So there's no point in talking about it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just glanced down, and we're over an hour.
Okay.
And so I have so many more things to talk to you about, but I know I can't keep you much longer. So I'm gonna go to me and you.
Okay.
Me and you. I think 1988. And I was still a grad student, and I was going to MPA, and I went to CTUP programming, the Council of Teachers of Undergraduate Psychology at MPA. And I sat in on, it was either CTUP or STP. And it would have
been CTUP.
I think you were organizing or chairing things. And I think that's where I first met you.
That's correct.
But I don't, and I think I told you this over this weekend. I have a letter from you. I think it was a generic letter that you sent, but you have your handwriting about it was nice that you participated. Do you want to get involved next year, kind of thing? And so that's my first memory of you. You did come out for a program review in 1994. You and Tom McGovern, which was great to see you on my campus, but a challenging visit.
Might have been a little bit of a challenging visit.
It was a challenging visit. Yeah.
Well, let me clarify the MPA business, because Council of Teachers of Undergraduate Psychology is no more, as far as I know.
That's correct.
And that was an organization that, if I remember right, you could join for $5 for a lifetime membership. Yep. So you can really tell how robust and vibrant that group was going to be.
Right.
But it was dedicated to trying to organize high-quality teaching sessions at the regional conferences. And in fact, back then, there was a bit of a rivalry between STP and CTUP. STP didn't see itself as having presence at regionals.
That's right.
But CTUP did, and if I remember right, we used to have a newsletter that would try to capture what was going on in all the regionals.
You edited the newsletter.
I did.
It was called Significant Difference.
That's right, it was. Ugh, yeah, it was a pain to produce.
Yeah.
But that's why I'm pretty sure it was CTUP.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember having opportunities because of you to go to AP reading. You talked me into that. That would give me that opportunity. You gave me the opportunity to write test item files for Sandrock and Halonen.
Oh my gosh, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
So we go back a long way.
We do.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For everything.
Oh, my pleasure.
You are my Bill McKeechee.
Oh. I was just waiting for that because we were going to spend all day yesterday blubbering, and now here we're going to do it on the podcast.
Thank you.
My pleasure, Eric.